The Space Marines are the foremost defenders of mankind. The Emperor's spear thrusts deep into the heart of his foes. These genetically engineered warriors are implacable, unyielding, and know no fear. Now, Chapter Master, it is time to lead your brothers to victory, for the glory of the Emperor. Hello there, everyone. It is time to talk about the final faction of the Imperium, and that is going to be the Space Marines, or the Adeptus Astartes as they are known as in Battlefleet Gothic Armada 2. And the Space Marines are all about the surgical strike, they are all about the boarding. Their ships in the lore is essentially equipped for more transport duty to be able to transport the Space Marines themselves to world after world for their endless duty towards protecting the Imperium man from any that threaten it. That does not mean they are not suitably equipped to deal with void combat. No, they have perhaps one of the most powerful ships in the game in the Battle Barge. This thing is equipped with 83 armor all around, very similar to the Necron Tomb ships, or hell, even all of the Necron ships, and it has a massive array of weaponry to complement it. In fact, the Battle Barges are probably the only ones of the Space Marine ships that are kind of capable of fighting toe-to-toe with any ship it comes up against, whereas the strike cruisers and vanguards, they are a little more lighter on the macro weaponry and instead rely almost exclusively on their torpedoes or their boarding potential to get victory a lot of the times. Due to the fact they have half the broadside weaponry of that of the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus in place of the bombardment cannons, and the higher speed and armor of these ships. I talked about the Battle Barge having 83 armor all around, all the other ships as well have that same armor. But you are not going to use these ships a lot for just winning the game of attrition, no. You are going to be doing the surgical strike a lot of the times. And with what I said about their boarding being incredibly potent, a lot of that comes down to the fact that the critical assault chance, their surgical strike trait, allows them to deal additional troop damage 60% of the time, anytime there's a boarding assault action done. And this is pretty significant to note. When you factor in this and the 50-50 chance of the exceptional troop efficiency, right when it comes down to it, the Space Marines are perhaps more effective at boarding than even that of the Tyranids, whereas the Tyranids will have to rely only on their 270-degree boarding, and everything else that complements it can be really tricky to get the additional boarding necessary, whereas the Space Marines have guided torpedoes with their boarding torpedoes, as well as the additional dumbfire torpedoes for raw damage when the situation warrants it. So if you need to kill something quickly or you're really confident of doing the damage straight up to get an early kill, and don't want to wait for the boarding damage to slowly cripple the ships down, you have these available to you, whereas the Tyranids do not. This is augmented even further when you add in this command skill Honor the Chapter, which gives additional assault actions based on the type of ship that's using the ability. The easy way to compare this is it's technically a shorter range lightning strike that does not require shields to be down to utilize. However, this changes drastically for the battle barges. Get a whopping 5 assault actions as opposed to 3 they would get if they did a lightning strike action. So the boarding potential you could do to a lot of ships is astounding, just with the broadside boarding the Honor the Chapter itself. Now, an important factor to keep in mind with the Space Marines when you're utilizing the boarding, as well as any other factions that are dedicated towards boarding heavy type of fleets like the Impaler Drukhari that's been getting popular over the days, and Tyranids, it is important to not overcommit on your boarding to a single ship, for then you end up using all your boarding actions at the very beginning on a single ship where it may not be necessary, which you could have used to perhaps start crippling down another ship. And this is going to be important to note for how getting critical hits with your boarding actually works. I found out recently is that the critical assault chance that you see on the stat screen could be misled that it's the chance of getting critical hits initially with boarding assaults. No, this is actually the trait to get additional troop damage, as you see with the surgical strike. These are one and the same. You could assume these are two different stats a lot of the time, especially with traits like Drukhari that get additional critical assault chance when they have a high troop complement. But the crucial thing to note when you start reaching those troop intervals that eventually will leave your opponent with a drifting hulk is that the critical hits that are applied are guaranteed to hit the component that you have prioritized. So when you bring it down to the second troop phase, the yellow phase, you are guaranteed the one critical hit on the component you prioritize, which may not always be a permanent destruction, so keep that in mind. And when you get to the heavy troop casualty step, the final phase, Then you're going to do 2 guaranteed critical hits, ideally on the component that you prioritize, if it has not already been permanently destroyed. This is an important factor, especially for Space Marines that rely heavily on crippling their opponents, so that way they can finish it off heavily. For your macro cannons are not what you're going to be relying on the majority of the time here, simply because it's going to take you a long time to get through the shields. The bombardment cannons are an amazing weapon, but it can be really tricky for them to complement the rest of your boarding and torpedo-centric type of playstyle, since you do need to get through the shields again for that high critical hit chance for it to matter. And while it is a bit of a weird trait to look at with the bombardment cannons, it's technically telling you twice that it has really high critical hit chance, as opposed to just inflating the critical chance right off the bat on the top of the stats. But technically, this will double the critical hit chance further, so if you were to use your lock-on for any period of time, you basically have a 90% chance of a critical hit. That is before considering the resistance of all the ships that you're shooting at. The Space Marines in the lore have always been about the surgical strike and crippling opponents immediately, and that is true with Armada 2 as well, since, as I said, your lower number of actual weaponry will leave a lot to be desired if you try and do a straight-up game of attrition with your opponent. In truth, they are used to clean up any drifting hulks or anything that's already crippled heavily, and you don't want to infest your valuable charges of your torpedoes or even your boarding to try and finish it off. It can be really tricky to do with the strike cruisers or the battle barges, as you do not have access to the solid right to get in close and catch your opponent off guard, but with their higher speed, this helps make up for it a lot, and their narrower profile will help to some extent for dodging torpedoes, and of course their mobility to avoid fighters and bombers. And the battle barge itself will serve as your anchor for any type of battle as well, since the 83 armor all around is astounding. Of course, the battle barge is incredibly expensive, tied with the Tomb Ship and the Void Stalker as one of the most expensive ships in the game. And this is not even considering the Custodian, which is kind of inflated a bit by its Wardens, but you get the point. This thing could take a beating. It has the ridiculously high resistance to deflect or at least wear off any critical hits that might be thrown at it. And with 3 bombardment cannons and incredibly powerful broadside weaponry, it is formidable. The only negative thing I have to say about this ship is that it is going to be outnumbered and as a result going to be overpowered by any adversary if it is not supported appropriately. And because it's so resilient to critical hits, you can almost recklessly use Honor the Chapter with your battle barge. Never mind the fact that the assault actions it provides is drastic in comparison to the strike cruiser and vanguards. So using this at every opportunity, if you think you can get away with it, is going to be important. For an important factor to keep in mind is if your opponent does not utilize a call33 the majority of the time, or at least roughly due to randomness of the actual troop damage you'll be doing, you will be basically doing about 33 points of troop damage without even including the boarding torpedoes themselves. This means that you can almost cripple cruisers that have average troop capacity just with the battle barge itself. And when you add the strike cruisers and their boarding torpedoes as well, you have very real possibility to take out multiple ships at once if you can aim them properly and position yourself in a way that your opponent cannot easily dodge them. For of course, the boarding torpedoes do have their guidance on them due to the fact that unless you're going with double battle barges or lots of vanguards, you are not going to have the convenience of fighters to kind of protect those torpedoes from the point defense like the Tau would with their seeker missiles. If you are not going that route, you are going to need to get up close and in their face. For all the point defense takes about 3 seconds for its entire salvo to do damage to the torpedoes. And while it never tells the actual stats and hit points of the torpedoes, this is really important to note as your torpedoes will almost never get shot down immediately unless you're firing right in the middle of their entire fleet. So if you can get up to the minimum range incredibly well and aim them effectively, you will, a good majority of the time, hit with everything. This is where the surgical strikes are incredibly important, as I hinted at, for you want to find those isolated targets and then dive bomb them for a very effective strike at killing blow. Don't get me wrong, the double battle barges are amazingly fun to deal with, and they have firepower that will pretty much rival a lot of the other factions, complemented with their armor, but you are trading off a lot of your mobility as a result of that. And there's incredibly slow mobility, even with the high energy turn that the battle barges have access to, will make it almost impossible for you to get your damaged torpedoes in outside of your initial charge. So having them to complement your damage is going to be insanely difficult. And while the Vanguards themselves are incredibly powerful vessels in their own right, due to the consistent nerfs that they received in the past few patches at the time of this recording, they are not really a valid fleet, a lot for the same reasons that when I was talking about my Shroud fleet when I did my Necron videos. The changes to the capture mechanics means you have to put a lot more effort into your fleet to get victory. And when you combo that with the fact that the Vanguards only have 2 charges of their assault boarding and their torpedoes now, you are in a lot of ways the underdogs in a lot of matchups. But the resilience comboed with the ridiculous speed and turning radius makes them incredibly dangerous for getting behind the backline of opponents, grabbing objectives, and then just punishing anything that ever gets isolated, whether it be on the other side of the map or not. And with Honor the Chapter, you have an endless supply of boarding options available to you, even though they are diminished quite heavily for your strike cruisers and vanguards. They are still nonetheless incredibly potent. Even if your opponent is to do the call to arms, you're still going to be normally doing 2 points of troop damage, which is still going to be incredibly significant, and you can rapidly kill off at least normal and weak crew capacity of fleets like that of the Town Merchant Fleet or the Adeptus Mechanicus. They will still succumb to your boarding incredibly quickly. And even those of normal troop capacity like the Tau Protector Fleet and Imperial Navy will still suffer heavy damage as a result, especially with what I mentioned earlier, that if you successfully prioritize your components, you'll be getting guaranteed critical hits on the components you actually want shot down, whether they be engines, generators, or even a deck to eventually break the morale for additional troop damage. They are, however, restricted or vulnerable to critical hits themselves, as the strike cruisers only have 200 shields available to each one of their ships, and this is, for every other faction, basically the same amount of shield points that light cruisers normally have. Whereas battleships would have 800, the battle barge has access to only 600 shields to it. It can still weather the fire incredibly well, but for strike cruisers and vanguards, you need to watch out for anything that has a high critical hit chance. Otherwise, you will have a very bad day really quickly if you let yourself get hit by mega cannons needlessly and suffer immediate engine critical hits. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2 fleets that I have played as with the Space Marines. And the first one's going to be the more well-rounded type of fleet with the battle barge, 3 strike cruiser Mark IIs with the torpedoes, and 2 Nova frigates. The very important factor to keep in mind that all the frigates have 83 armor as well, so they are some of the most ridiculously durable frigates in the game. They are incredibly pricey as a result of that though, so you need to be very diligent with how you utilize them. But even with that said, the Nova complements this incredibly well by perhaps being the fastest frigate in the game, with good use of the all-head full, while the battle barge itself, as I already said, makes an amazing anchor to your fleet, and comboed with a micro warp jump using your Novas for fission, you can get it into the fight incredibly easy, even if it's out in the middle of nowhere. You just gotta be very mindful of where you jump it into, for you don't want to leave it open to a heavy amount of torpedoes at the very beginning of the match if you can help it. And then while the battle barges distract them and tanking all the fire, your strike cruisers will dive on in and look for openings to prioritize and kill whatever target you can with the torpedoes, whether they be boarding torpedoes or your dumbfire torpedoes. And a really important factor here is if you decide to go for the raw damage with the torpedoes, make absolute sure that your boarding is on a secondary ship. That way you are priming a secondary ship to be in a drifting hulk, while you just fire your bombardment cannons and torpedoes on your primary target. That is essentially going to be very key, while light boarding damage is still incredibly good if you want to get the guaranteed critical hits on like an engine for something that's more nimble, or something that relies heavily on its shields, like a battleship per se with supercharged void shields. So if you don't want to go too ridiculous on killing off an entire crew of a ship, just a light amount to make sure you get that first troop casualty step is enough to make sure you cripple the ship for the follow-up fire. And that concept of trying to focus on 2 ships at once is a very important factor for my 5 strike cruiser fleet. It's equipped with the cruisers as I mentioned already, and it has 4 hunters to complement it, and provide a lot of vision, as well as occasional boarding torpedoes for anything that's already crippled and weakened. And this is very important since, unlike the battle barge which has the firepower, the strike cruisers are a lot more lacking and it's going to be noticed really quickly. By its sheer speed in comparison to the relying on the battle barge, allows you to pick which target you want relatively well. They still have the same rotation speed as all the other Imperial Navy ships, so you need to be careful about using high energy turn. But so long as you're not facing off against lances or anything that can guaranteed hit you at long range, you can effectively get an advantageous position to dive bomb an opponent, then strike them down with your boarding and your dumbfire torpedoes. Keep in mind, your Imperial Navy torpedoes do 110 damage, as opposed to the majority of the other factions doing 90 points of damage. So if you can hit the vulnerable portions of the armor, or even get critical hits that allow you to ignore the armor entirely, you can rapidly kill things quickly with just a mere handful of these torpedoes, and while at the same time using your boarding, as well as maybe honor the chapter if you feel like you can get away with it, to rapidly cripple a secondary ship. And if you prioritize the component that you want for that ship that you're boarding, it will very easily be vulnerable to your follow-up attack, if not kill the crew outright. While the strike cruisers and vanguards have the 83 armor, they still have less hit points than that of the Imperial Navy and Adeptus Mechanicus, so they can still be really vulnerable to anything that has armor-piercing potential to them, and like I said, your lower amount of weaponry will leave you very vulnerable if you can't get the precision required. So with that said, you will probably have to individually control your cruisers one at a time, so that way you can make sure you get as close as possible without getting in the way of your other ships. If you do this properly and your opponent doesn't have the mobility to evade effectively, you can get a cruiser kill incredibly quickly, and their higher speed allows them to effectively keep a distance away from any fighters and bombers incredibly well. Although any heavy fighters fleets that are coming after you, either to protect against bombers or torpedoes, are going to be incredibly problematic, as you can't actually outrun them. But if you already have distance away from the fighters to begin with, and you are within distance of a gas cloud or asteroid belt, you can at least lose the lock of these bombers and torpedoes just by boosting towards them if you have enough distance from you and the fighters that are chasing after you. And the strike cruisers are also pretty damn effective at grabbing objectives as well. Whereas the vanguards are kind of neutered heavily by that change, the strike cruisers benefit greatly if you have 2 or 3 of them trying to grab points. And since you are always visible, it's not a huge concern about trying to get early momentum, as you won't have the convenience of getting the jump on your opponent regardless. Now I'm going to talk about some of the important skills and upgrades you should seriously look into with the Space Marines, whether they be with the battle barge or the strike cruisers. A lot of these skills are very nicely interchangeable depending on the faction you're up against, but some of them are more important than others. Most importantly, the disruption bomb. I talked about how you're going to have a really difficult time getting through shields. Hell, even the battle barge is going to have a hard time just because it's the only ship in your fleet that can do a lot of damage with its cannons. But when your strike cruisers and vanguards are a lot weaker in that regard, they can't support effectively enough. Even the lances and fighter bays are not really designed to go through shields. The lances' armor-piercing potential encourages them to hit armor as opposed to the shields, so having something like a disruption bomb helps tremendously in that regard. And its wide radius, as well as having 4 charges to your battle barge if you have one in play, gives you a lot of longevity for this type of ability. The micro warp jump ability is a must for any type of battle barge, since its impact allowing your battle barge to get into the fray immediately and cause some havoc early on, especially since it can single-handedly kill the crew of most ships on its own, cannot be understated. It is a bit questionable whether it's valuable for your strike cruisers and vanguards if you are forfeiting the battle barge in your fleet, but it is still damn potent for keeping your ships alive and even just baiting your opponents if you are going with more mobility instead. All the other skills have their place with the Space Marine fleet, but Just like as I mentioned with the Adeptus Mechanicus, since they are all the generic type of skills except for Emperor's Tarot, you will have to use them based on what faction you're up against. Plasma Bombs for things like Necrons or anything that has slow mobility, Supercharged Void Shield if you want to get the most out of your battle barges, and Stasis Bombs if you can reliably trap them for doing hit and run type of attacks with Vanguards or Strike Cruisers. But for upgrades themselves, there are kind of only a few that are really noteworthy that you want to look into. The Culexus Assassin complements the playstyle of the Space Marines amazingly well. While you are going to want to board at almost every opportunity, so it can be difficult to try and find a window for this, especially at the very beginning of a match. But if the enemy fleet is already half morale or even around that roughly if they have lower bravery, then you can cause a mutiny and force them to kill off a third of their crew instantly, if not just force them to flee to battle if you manage to destroy their deck up to this point. It may not necessarily be necessary at the very beginning of the battle, but so long as your flagship's around and you have access to lightning strikes, this will rapidly cause a ship to be useless in a battle, whether by killing another third of its crew or just forcing a position where it can't rally in any form at all. This is almost always a must-have upgrade. The First Company Terminators, while this only works for the flagship, and keep in mind you're only going to be doing like at most 3 assault actions with a lightning strike, this will allow you to get guaranteed troop damage when you use the lightning strike. Although arguably the boarding assault is almost always going to be better, but if you're using the Culexus Assassin, you can get additional value out of this regardless. Armor-piercing ammunition, while I question its usability for Space Marines due to the fact that their broadside macro weaponry is a lot more limited outside the battle barges, this sadly does not work with the bombardment cannons. It is, however, still a lot of additional damage if you are facing off against anything that has AC armor like Necrons or Orcs that are facing their prow towards you, so you can get some value out of it otherwise. The only reason you would seriously consider this is that a lot of the other upgrades are a little more questionable or not that usable in a lot of circumstances. But with battle barges, the difference will be noticed at the very least. The R-Rent pattern weaponries, this really is only useful for a battle barge of sorts, but if you're waiting patiently and trying to get more use out of your torpedoes by being at further range, then this could be a useful upgrade for you, especially when combo with the Disruption Bomb and your lock-on. You can still get some very effective critical hits, especially against cruisers or even light cruisers. However, the further away that your opponent is, the lot easier it is to dodge your macro weaponry, and bombardment cannons with their long rate of fire of 15 seconds are incredibly easy to dodge if your opponent knows what they're doing. So consider the long range approach carefully if you're going this route. Advanced Void Shield pattern, this is useful for getting a little more longevity out of your ships, and like I talked about with my Adeptus Mechanicus video, this will not be mitigated by lances or anything with armor piercing. So for battle barges, especially comboed with Supercharged Void Shield, you're gonna get that extra longevity to help make up for your lack of 800 shields, or even the 200 shields of your strike cruisers. It will be useful since the most important factor to keep in mind with your shields is that so long as your shields are up, you will not suffer any kind of critical hit damage from any direct weaponry. A Mission Dissipator, this is almost exclusively useful for the Vanguards, but as their effectiveness is heavily diminished with the recent patches, this won't really be useful unless you want to get your frigates up forward really quickly without being noticed. However, keep in mind that their boosting will be audible. Your opponent will actually be able to hear the boosting, so they can pinpoint where your frigates or even your Vanguards are if you use this too recklessly. But it can be essential to get to locations quickly without fear of being shot at. And that is everything with the Space Marines. They are a damn fun faction to play as, although they are not, you cannot play them in the traditional manner of just wearing down your opponent with just macro weaponry. As fearsome as the bombardment can be, it is possibly one of the best type of weapons in the game. It's just, you don't use the bombardment can to do damage. You use it to try and get the critical hits on your opponent, especially if you can get away with the lock-on, as reload a lot of the time may be more useful, especially since it reduces the cooldown time of your torpedoes and your combustion gauge. But if you are able to find situations to get that 9% critical hit chance, you will be very effective at getting critical hits on your opponent. And you may not even have to rely on boarding to cripple your opponent in the ways that you want. I thank you all for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I will see you on the battlefield.